Remember Mythbusters? Throughout the 2000s and early 2010s, Mythbusters was one of the most popular science-based shows in the entire world. Every week, we got to see the cast put popular myths and urban legends to the test. Is it likely that the Alcatraz prison escape was successful? If you drink Diet Coke and instantly eat Mentos right after, would your stomach explode? And most importantly, could Jack and Rose have shared the door in Titanic? Myths like these kept many of us addicted to the show for several years. But out of nowhere in late 2015, the Mythbusters announced that the longest-running show on the Discovery Channel was coming to an end in 2016. For most of us, this was a complete surprise given that the show was still as entertaining as ever. Since then, we've seen multiple spin-offs emerge, including Mythbusters The Search, White Rabbit Project, Mythbusters Jr., and Motor Mythbusters. While some of these were great in their own right, it was of course never as good as the original. So, what happened to Mythbusters and why was the show cancelled? While it may seem like Mythbusters ended abruptly, there was actually a slew of fundamental issues that plagued the team for years. One of these issues was the chemistry between the team members themselves, specifically Adam and Jamie. Now, this might come as a surprise to many of you, but Adam and Jamie aren't actually friends. And this isn't speculation or some sort of fan theory. Both of them have actually been extremely transparent about how they don't actually get along in real life. Adam said, quote, "We don't get along very well together on a personal level. In the 25 years that we've known each other, we've never had dinner alone together." Similarly, when asked if it would be an exaggeration to say that Jamie didn't really like Adam, Jamie replied, "No, we certainly had respect for each other, but we really weren't friends." Considering this, it's extremely impressive that this duo was able to sustain such a productive professional relationship for so long. But if it was up to them, they wouldn't voluntarily work with each other. In other words, the opportunity to work together didn't keep them on the show by any means. They each had their own independent reasons to do the show, and when those reasons dissolved, they didn't hesitate to split ways. If you're wondering about the relationship between Tori, Carrie, and Grant, these guys were basically the exact opposite of Adam and Jamie. They got along extremely well. In fact, here's what Grant had to say about it. "The three of us, you, Tori, and I, we are beyond friends. We are siblings. We shared a long, wild adventure learning from each other the whole way. Our cameraman nicknamed us technical, practical, and logical because we were so different, but we could solve any problem together." Clearly, this trio liked working with each other, but that wasn't enough to deter them from leaving the show when the time came either. You see, interest in Mythbusters was slowly declining over the years. Now, I know it makes a lot of you guys upset when I say things like this, because yes, even after the decline, Mythbusters was still super popular. However, when you're constantly trying to produce bigger seasons with bigger myths and bigger budgets, it's not really sustainable when viewership and ratings are declining. And according to the data, the decline was pretty clear. Take a look at Google Trends for example. The search data says that interest in Mythbusters peaked between 2006 and 2008. There were two singular peaks in 2009 and 2011, but for the most part, the underlying decline continued. And by the time the show ended, it was only pulling in 20-30% of the interest that it was pulling in during its peak. And if you don't believe Google, just listen to Adam himself describe the issue.
So Mythbusters was on for 14 years. Everything in the world has its own bell curve. So we signed that contract when our ratings were at their absolute peak. And then slowly, over the next 5 years, they started their slide. They still was respectable ratings by the end, but that slide happened.
So, while Mythbusters was still quite popular and adored by its superfans, the average viewer was starting to tune out. And this makes sense given that the Mythbusters had already tested the most popular myths. There's only so many Jack and Rose scenes and Walter White scenes that everyone knows. Sooner or later, you're gonna have to tackle less popular myths that aren't as appealing to the general audience. And eventually, this led to declining ratings, which took a toll on the show. One of the first shortfalls that was extremely evident to viewers was what happened to Tori, Grant, and Carrie. In 2014, it was announced that the B-cast would be eliminated and that the show would simply focus on Adam and Jamie. According to the producers, what Grant, Carrie, and Tori were asking for was unreasonable. We never really got a solid explanation as to what exactly they asked for or why negotiations didn't end up fruitful. At first, there was some speculation that this trio might have grown some resentment for each other just like Adam and Jamie. But they would soon turn around and star in the White Rabbit project together, so this likely wasn't the case. The more likely scenario is that the trio wanted to maintain their compensation or increase it, and given that viewership was declining, this simply wasn't feasible. Something else to note is that it seems like the trio did not agree with the direction that the producers were taking Mythbusters. Instead of myths being at the center of each episode, it felt like the producers wanted more explosions and theatrics. They probably thought that this would help retain viewers, but it kind of just caused the show to lose its original appeal. Once Carrie, Grant, and Tori were removed from the show, ratings just declined even faster. While some viewers were indifferent to the change, most viewers were upset that they were cut from the show. They felt that the trio gave a healthy break from the antics of Adam and Jamie. Also, Carrie was the only woman that was left on the show. And given that STEM fields are generally skewed towards men, many young girls looked up to Carrie. But unfortunately, this didn't last. Moving on to the last 2 seasons of Mythbusters, given that the cast was cut in half, the number of myths tested per show was also cut in half. Each episode only covered 2 myths instead of 3 or 4 like before. On the bright side, this allowed the producers to spend more time showing the engineering behind each project. Adam and Jamie also had more time to explain the science behind each experiment. While these facets were welcomed by superfans, to the average viewer, this likely just felt slower paced and not as exciting. And soon enough, Adam and Jamie's 5-year contract was coming to an end as well, meaning that it was time to renegotiate. Adam was actually super transparent about this, stating that he simply wasn't willing to do the show for less compensation.
Do you keep the show going? Well, Discovery's not going to want to pay us more to keep on doing the show. And frankly, after 14 years, and I'm 50 now, I'm tired. I'm definitely not going to do the show for less.
And given that Discovery wasn't willing to allocate a bigger budget, the only option was to shut it down. The silver lining is that Discovery let Jamie and Adam end the show on their terms. They were allowed to call it a final season, and they were able to test some of the biggest myths yet. But the best part was that they were able to invite Carrie, Tori, and Grant to do a wrap-up episode. This conclusion was extremely well received by the fans, given that it was the highest rated Mythbusters episode of all time. So while it was a shame that Mythbusters came to an end earlier than people wanted, it's nice that the show at least got the ending that it deserved. In terms of what the Mythbusters are up to today, they've all gone down their own paths. Starting with Adam, while he left Mythbusters, he never really gave up the show business. He went on to host 2 more shows called Mythbusters Jr. and Savage Builds. Given the name Mythbusters Jr., I don't think you'd be surprised to hear that it had a similar premise to the original show. Instead of having adults test these myths, however, we had teenagers. And Adam was basically their mentor, leading them through the design, assembly, and testing processes. As for Savage Builds, this show was focused on new inventions and restoration projects. Adam collaborated with industry experts and friends to make things like the Iron Man suit and the Wheel of Death. Savage Builds actually performed quite well. However, both of these shows were cancelled after just 1 season. Adam wasn't just involved in TV shows either. He also had a cameo in 2048, Nowhere to Run, and he published a book called Every Tool is a Hammer, Life is What You Make It. Likely his most significant project over the past several years, however, is his YouTube channel. Adam became the face of the YouTube channel Tested, and they even renamed the channel to Adam Savage's Tested. The channel has nearly 6 million subscribers, and they post a new video almost every day about science and building. Anyway, moving on to Jamie, his life after Mythbusters hasn't been nearly as eventful. He has more or less left the show business and is mainly focused on personal projects. For example, he built a tank that's specifically designed for firefighting. He also received an honorary doctorate in technology from Lappeenranta University of Technology in 2017. This was actually his 3rd honorary doctorate. He had previously received one from Villanova University and the University of Twente. More recently, he was appointed as a professor at Lund University in November of 2021. This was a 5-year contract, so this is probably where he'll spend the majority of his time in the coming years. Moving on to Tori, he's basically just jumped from one show to another. Shortly after Mythbusters ended, he started hosting a show called Thrill Factor with Carrie. The show focuses on the science and engineering behind roller coasters and amusement park rides and explains why certain attractions are so thrilling. After Thrill Factor, Tori went on to host White Rabbit Project with, of course, Carrie and Grant. He took a few years off from the show business after White Rabbit Project, but he eventually returned in 2019 with The Great Escapists. Since then, he's also appeared on The Explosion Show and The Jackass Forever. So things haven't changed all that much for Tori. The same can be said about Carrie as well. She of course also hosted Thrill Factor and White Rabbit Project, but she's done a few things on her own as well. For example, she hosted Crash Test World. This show focuses on the tech capitals of the world and how these various cities are helping build our future. Aside from starring in these shows, Carrie also helped found an educational streaming service called Explore Media. The streaming service is still super new, so we'll have to see how it plays out. And finally, last but definitely not least, we have Grant. After Mythbusters and White Rabbit Project, Grant went on to host the second season of Home of the Future. As the name suggests, this show focuses on futuristic homes filled with the newest tech. Grant also had a cameo in the TV movie Sharknado 3. Grant hasn't just been working on the front end of movies and TV shows either. He also spent a lot of time on the back end as well. For example, in 2017, he consulted with Disney for 6 months to help them build better animatronics. While things were going pretty good for Grant career-wise, he would unfortunately be hit with an intracranial aneurysm in July of 2020, which took his life. He was only 49 years old at the time, which leaves him with the most tragic ending. While it's already been several years since Mythbusters ended, I'd be willing to bet that the effect of Mythbusters will live on for decades. Mythbusters inspired millions of kids and teenagers to pursue careers in science and engineering, and who knows what these young minds will come up with in the coming decades. In terms of the show itself ending, it really just came down to declining viewership and a limited budget. But honestly, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. More times than not, we see shows go on for way too long. Mythbusters was able to end off at a time where viewers still wanted more, which is why all of us still remember it in such a positive light even after all these years. And I'm not sure if any other ending could have created such a lasting effect, but that's just what I think. Did you watch Mythbusters growing up? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you're glad that Mythbusters ended off strong. And of course, consider joining our Discord community to suggest future video ideas and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.